Welcome to the Summer of Open Data, a series of panels that focuses on the so-called third wave of open data, which we do together with a variety of partners, including the Open Data Institute, the Open Data Charter, BrightHive, and data.world at Georgetown University. And I'm delighted today to be joined with a stellar panel of experts that will look into a variety of the aspects of what we call the third wave of open data. Just as a backup, when we talk about the third wave of open data, we talk about 4 areas that we believe could be transformative as relates to open data if we make any progress. One is around the use of open data at the subnational level, in addition to what is already achieved nationally and internationally. 2 is the advances in using private sector data for public good through data collaboration and other means. Thirdly, to do all of this in a manner that is responsible and accountable and also adheres to new notions of ethical principles. And then lastly, to unleash data in a manner and it is really published with purpose. So those are the 4 areas that we are exploring. And as I said, today we have actually 4 people that are at the forefront of our thinking and their thinking and the thinking of society with regard to those, to those areas. So without further ado, let me ask each of them to introduce briefly themselves, and then we go into the meat of the discussion. And let me start with Nuria. Nuria, can you briefly introduce yourself and also indicate what your connection is to the third wave of open data or data in general?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stefan, for the invitation to this very interesting seminar. So I'm Nuria Oliver, and I'm a computer scientist. I have a PhD in artificial intelligence. I've been working on data, sort of like my area is data-driven machine learning. So I've been working with data for over 25 years. And more broadly speaking, on the topic of the use of large-scale data for public good, for the public interest, or for social good since 2009. Right now, I am co-founder of ELIS, which is the European Laboratory for Learning and Intelligence Systems. And I'm also commissioner to the president of the Valencian region on AI and data science for to fight against COVID-19. So I have been experiencing some of the barriers and challenges around using data to help make better decisions in the context of a public administration for the past 6 months.
Great, thanks so much, Nuria. And I'm sure we will touch on some of those in a second. Patrick, can you briefly introduce yourself?
So my name is Patrick McGarry. I'm currently incarnated as the head of strategic partnerships for data.world. Data.world, among the open side of things, is a public repository for the world's open data. We have hundreds of thousands of open data sets. My background is primarily in open source and building global networks of developers around software. And I'm now bridging a lot of that for the last several years, that experience and knowledge into the data space. Data collaboration, both in open networks of data collaborators as well as private networks of data collaborators. So it's definitely interesting to see a platform like data.world where I can observe hundreds of thousands, nearing 1 million now users on the platform in public, as well as a large sort of private repository of governments and organizations and corporations and things like that. So kind of sitting at the nexus of all the different types of data users and getting to see what they do has been very enlightening.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrick, for joining us. John?
Hi, I'm John Goldbanks at Sage Bionetworks. I've been working in and around open data for about 15 years, starting at Creative Commons and the Science Commons Project, where I worked a lot on data licensing, background, research, structure, and systems. For the last 9 years, I've been at Sage Bionetworks, which is a nonprofit biomedical research organization. And there I work more broadly on data governance, which is really thinking about how the contract systems that are required by regulatory and ethical systems around human medical data in particular, how those correlate to concepts of crowdsourcing, community reuse, and open science.
Great, thanks so much. And Sui Leng.
Thanks very much, Stefan, and such a pleasure to be here today with you all. My name is Sui Leng Harris, and I am what I like to describe as a reformed lawyer, formerly a practicing lawyer in Australia. I now work in the space of what I would describe as law and policy at Luminate, which is a global philanthropic foundation that works to promote stronger societies. I'm in the data and digital rights teams there, where we support a number of organizations working on open data.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much to you all for joining. And as I indicated, this is an amazing team, and I will have to constrain myself to keep this short within the hour or the 45 minutes that we have allocated for this. So let's start with Nuria. And so one of the areas that, as I mentioned, that we are interested in is really how do we leverage private sector data for public good? And of course, COVID-19 has been the ultimate natural experiment and use case for exploring data collaboration. And so I would love to get your sense, based upon past experience, current experiences, of what's the state of data collaboration and what are some of the lessons learned of the last 6 months.
Thank you, Stefan. So yeah, so maybe a good way to answer this question is to share with everyone our experience in the Valencian region. So the Valencian region is on the east of Spain. It has roughly 6 million people, between 5 and 6 million people living there. And at the beginning of the pandemic, the president was supportive of the idea of creating a team of experts called Data Science Against COVID-19 Expert Group. And it's composed of 20 plus scientists from the Valencian universities and research centers working philanthropically and altruistically in trying to leverage data to have a better understanding of the situation, to make predictions and to sort of like assist in better policy making. Also to use the data to measure and evaluate the success or not, of certain policies. So it's been quite of an enlightening experience. We have worked on 4 work streams. So I was named commissioner for this, and my job as commissioner has been to lead this team of volunteers, me myself also being a volunteer on this topic. So our first area has been human mobility modeling, because of course human mobility is key in the context of a pandemic. And we have, I think, a very nice example of a private-public collaboration because we've been able to leverage human mobility computed from the mobile network infrastructure via a collaboration that the Spanish National Office of Statistics had with the 3 largest telcos in the country. So I think this is probably a very nice example of 3 private companies working with a trusted third party, which in this case was the National Office of Statistics, sharing aggregate data. So the National Office of Statistics could aggregate this aggregate data and create indicators of aggregate mobility between different sort of like regions in Spain. And we were the pilot region from Spain to be able to use this data. And we've been doing this since March quite successfully, even though, as you know, some of the challenges on these collaborations are around finding sustainable financial model for this to happen, because of course pandemic is a very exceptional situation where everyone is trying to help. There is a lot of solidarity, a lot of the things are done pro bono, a lot of things are done for free, but it's not necessarily sustainable over a long time period. The second work stream has been on epidemiological models, and we've built 2 types of models, meta-population models and individual models. And there, our main data sources have been the publicly disclosed number of cases, number of hospitalizations, number of deaths, and so forth. And there, the biggest observation is that when we talk about data, we have to talk about the quality of the data. And it's become very evident that there were tremendous issues in terms of data quality. What does a case mean? How do you count cases? Is it just PCRs, or is it also the fast test? Is it the serological test? There is a delay in the accounting of the cases and so forth. So the data quality was definitely and has definitely been an issue, which of course has an impact on the modeling. The third work stream has been on predictive models, which also was feeding from the same data, and thus has also suffered from the challenges of having noisy data. And then the last work stream has been on a citizen science project where we launched one of the largest citizen surveys, definitely the largest in Spain, but one of the largest in the world. It's called COVID-19 Impact Survey, and it has over 300,000 answers worldwide, but the vast majority are from Spain. And it's been an interesting strategy to capture data that we didn't have a source for. We wanted to have a sensor of the situation and the perception of society during the pandemic. And there were a lot of very interesting questions that we didn't have any data to be able to answer them. For example, how much longer are people willing to sustain, the confinement? How are people getting infected if we are actually confined? What is the state of health of people? Are there tests available, or are there not tests available, and so forth? So we launched these really short surveys, only 25 questions, and it's still ongoing. We analyze the data on a weekly basis. It's fully anonymous. So I think it's also an interesting example of reaching out to society and involving everyone, the civil society at large, into providing with very useful and necessary data as a complement to whatever data sources were available. So thinking in terms of the nature of the data in this task force, we have been able to have access to privately held data from the telcos, to public data from the Ministry of Health and other public administration offices, and then the citizens, sort of like data, through the answers to the survey.
Great, fascinating, and I will come back to some of those as well. So Patrick, moving on to you, and especially building upon what Nuria said, you're head of strategic partnerships, and so what we are very interested in is that what are the kinds of new partnerships that are emerging around data? And so I would love to get your experience of the last 6 months to, anyway, the last few years while you're at data.world, but also coming back to what Nuria mentioned at the beginning, which was the challenge of sustainability, right? So there is a lot of, anyway, especially, and it's actually quite interesting, Nuria, to see, and I would like to come back to you perhaps on that as well, is that at the beginning of COVID-19, everyone jumped in, right? And it was like, anyway, let's solve it. And now 6 months later,
this is lasting too long, people are just like, wow.
That this is not a sprint, but a marathon. Yeah. And so you already see actually the energy evolving. And so I would love to get your sense, Patrick, on, anyway, what do you see happening in new kinds of partnership models, but also how do you make this sustainable over time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question that's, I think, is rolling around in everybody's mind. The interesting thing with COVID in particular is I think we have started to see an exploration of ways of using data and ways of collaborating around data that historically we just haven't seen broad scale adoption of before. I think we've all probably been involved in a project here or there around the coronavirus initiatives, and our own efforts. We decided we didn't want to create something new. We wanted to kind of filter and sort through kind of what was there and try to rise the cream to the crop, as it were. So we started what was called a data resource hub, and we started working with various different partners that were out there. From the Associated Press to the Wunderman Thompson and Amazon and a bunch of different people across the industry, and really we were trying to see what data was out there that was clean, what data was usable, and so it was kind of hard because a lot of people took a very specific tact on it. Some were heavily motivated by self-interest, and others were just trying to wrap their heads around the problem early on because it was, a thing that we'd never really done before. These sort of combination of, looking at data philanthropy, data collaboration across organizations that weren't used to playing nice together. And so, and a number of different factors. So I think from a partnerships viewpoint in particular, I think it was interesting to see sort of, the people that surfaced as leaders in data creation, people that surfaced as leaders in data curation, people that surfaced as leaders in sort of data analysis, and then, the data proliferation. I think there were people that kind of leaned into those different roles. And so, I think looking forward, to me, it's about how can we allow the people that were good at each of those roles to sort of participate cross-purpose, right? And I think this is the hardest thing is historically data has been very segmented and very ill-used. It's just not been operationalized within organizations, let alone across organizations. A lot of this is due to the fact that, data was seen as very proprietary, data was seen as, hard to share. We're only just now starting to scratch the surface on data licensing, in terms of being able to share data or collaborate on data in a way that isn't destructive to the originator of that data. So, looking at, across governments and private organizations and journalism and a number of different things, it was definitely interesting to sort of look at what are some of the new models that are going to be coming in the future? How are people going to collaborate? And what are the frameworks that we can do to set up? And I mean, a lot of this is something that data.world was actually created to address. We were created as a public benefit corporation and a BLab, we're one of the definite participants of the BLab folks. So really we were designed to be a mission-driven organization, even though we're still a for-profit company, right? So we believe in things like the proliferation of open data, being the repository, the gratis repository of the world's open data, and trying as much as possible to create, a Switzerland, I guess, of data where people can collaborate around, projects just like this. We've actually started another initiative around, it's much more focused on sort of American law enforcement data, but there are topics like this all over the world where it's incredibly important that we get the answers right. And in order to do so, we have to get the data right. And thus far, we have done an absolutely abysmal job in a lot of cases for these incredibly important topics. If you look at law enforcement data in the United States, it's terrible. It is absolutely atrocious. And only just now, with a lot of the political pressure and friction that's come to bear, have lawmakers started to create laws. And we've started to try to bring some of these lessons learned around COVID and bring together different organizations and individuals that are very expert at these different portions along sort of the data process workflow. To help educate our policymakers and decision makers around how can data become a first-class citizen in these discussions and in the implementation of laws and things going forward. So I think it's those sorts of initiatives where people are going to have a passion for a particular topic. And I think as the general population becomes more educated on not only the power of data, but the correct usage of it, I think we're going to see a lot more of this type of collaboration. So I don't know. I don't know the answer, unfortunately, but it's definitely trending in the right direction, at least.
Well, it's definitely a very informed answer, Patrick, and I think it's very interesting to also see indeed the emergence of new kinds of, what we call disintermediaries, right? Which is a function that you play, and we've had another Summer of Open Data panel with, like for instance, Open North in Canada, who's also trying to play this kind of intermediary, and also even Tanzania Data Lab that also, is trying to understand. There's need for organizations like yours that are actually identifying those different actors and bring them together. But John, Patrick was talking about the need for frameworks for collaboration. And it seems to me that this is a topic that you've worked on quite a long time. And so would love to get your sense, John, on how are we doing with those frameworks of collaboration, and also anyway, what do we need to do to also de-risk some of those collaborations? Because obviously it's not all nirvana that we are talking about. And so how do we go about de-risking, and what's the role of frameworks towards that?
Thank you. And it's fun to be able to follow smart people, because I can respond to some of the things that both Nuria and Patrick have said already. I mean, when you talk about frameworks, I think part of the hard part about data is that most of the mental models we have for open come from open source software, which I think is probably I'm not saying that open source software is easy, but I think it may be the easiest kind of open. Because you've got copyright, and because software is written in languages built by people. And so you don't have to worry about like the natural world and modeling the natural world, which in biology and biomedicine, that's kind of your goal, is to model real things, not human design things. And so frameworks are where we've wound up at Sage, because you can't just make a license, put it on the internet, let people download it, and that will actually lead to downstream, right, commons-based peer production of knowledge. We just don't have evidence that that's happening at scale in data the way that we see it in software. And so frameworks start to get at it. And the reason why that we really focus on frameworks is, as an organization, a lot of our job is building engagement in communities around data that's being generated by national investments and taxpayer dollars in sciences. And so we sort of start from that says, well, if our job is to convene 10 laboratories in Alzheimer's disease, right, well, how would we govern that collaboration? When that collaboration is going to happen in the cloud natively, how do we hybridize the legal structures to the technical structures? And more than anything, how do we serve that community to get out of their way so they can actually do their science? Because the big risk in framework building is that scientists will start and they'll say, well, oh, okay, we need a governance working group. And you'll suddenly have a bunch of geneticists working on governance and licensing and not doing genetics work. And that's kind of what you want to avoid. And so standardizing those frameworks, stabilizing them, and then balancing the need to customize any given framework for any given use with how standard you can make it is really the goal. The way that we try to do that is we start by asking, what are the questions that we want to answer? One of the sort of biggest risks in data frameworks is to answer general problems with general solutions and never actually have a specific thing that you have to do correctly to be successful or not. And by saying, are there scientific questions that we have to answer to be successful, and generating the governance by generalizing out of that towards a set of standard frameworks has been where we've been successful. And so it's this forcing function that both lets you get through the gates of arguments where you don't have consensus, but also it means that you've actually made something useful. Because we work in what's awfully termed human subjects research, we also start from the perspective of what are the risk benefits for the humans in the data, and have we balanced those appropriately? And pre-COVID, that was, we were moving towards participant engagement, right? How do we work, whether it's groups of people or qualitative interviews or focus groups? And sort of in the COVID era, we're in a public health emergency. And so we haven't seen a lot of roles for direct engagement. It's more about, can we, in a more paternalistic mode, play the role of, what would an attack look like on a data set? What would a re-identification attack, an exfiltration attack? Have we successfully designed against those, balanced with the mandate to get lots of people looking at the COVID data to help generate insights quickly? And that really gets at the way that you start to de-risk these things. And there are certain levers you can pull that aren't necessarily congruent with the open definitions. It's like one of them is you can block data download and force people to work in the enclave, right? They put their hands through the wall with the gloves and they manipulate the data there. That's magnificent for de-risking, but it limits your user base compared to downloadability. Another one is what we think of as transaction costs that filter out users who are just kind of trolls, right? Because a lot of the risk we have comes from trolling. So requiring identity registration of the data user, is a very powerful anti-troll technique. Introducing transaction costs like a quiz around the terms of service is a transaction cost that sort of pushes trolls elsewhere. And so if you think about this mixture of your contracts and how you're going to enforce them, the transaction costs on the actual user registration process, and then all the way to restricting things like download, like those three things together can work to create a significantly de-risking environment. You never eliminate the risk, but the goal again is not to eliminate the risk and the risk benefit part of the equation, but to balance it. And we have to be very honest about the fact that the risk is higher than we want it to be. And at least in the short term, the benefits are lower than we want them to be. The benefits will come out over time. So designing to that is really what we've had to try to do.
Great, brilliant. And yeah, I'm gonna have to constrain myself to ask all kinds of additional questions, because I do want to go to Sui Leng, and I almost, anyway, Sui Leng, I almost have the question, what's your reaction to all of this? But a more targeted question, Sui Leng, would be that obviously, anyway, a lot of the work that you are doing now as a recovered lawyer is around this notion of data rights and also accountabilities associated with rights, or even notions of data sovereignty, which again is a term that is being used in a variety of contexts. But so I would love to get your reaction, Sui Leng, from a data rights perspective on what you've heard so far, but also has COVID-19 been an occasion to actually make data rights part of the conversation, or as John illustrated, has it also perhaps in an area where actually data rights or individual data rights might have been seen as, well, let's just get the job done and then we're going to think about engaging citizens. So, and again, I'm not saying that John said that, but that was one of the ways to think about it. So any reactions, Sui Leng?
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, my main reaction has been a lot of head nodding throughout. Fascinating discussion. I think a lot of what, especially, the previous speakers have pointed to is different aspects of how we need to think about making data and open data trustworthy. If we want people to trust these things, these systems need to be worthy of that trust. And the kinds of mechanisms and approaches and design features that John described are really important ways of mitigating risks and thus improving trust. The importance of having good data, of having accurate data, and I can't put it better than the other speakers have already put it. And then it also comes to issues of these systems being rights respecting and accountable. And I think one of the really interesting things that the pandemic has produced in the UK context in particular is a sort of consciousness raising of data and of data-driven systems. And the reason I'm saying in the UK context is not because I think it's necessarily exceptional, but it's the context I'm most familiar with. But I know, talking to family in Australia, these are not trends only happening in the UK. So, for example, in relation to contact tracing apps, which have obviously been a really important potential technological assist for countering the pandemic, but also the focus of a lot of media attention in terms of how data about people are being used and who will have access to it, what will be open, what won't be open, and so on. And in those discussions, I think there's been a really pronounced increased awareness and increased consciousness of people being really interested in how their data how data about them rather was going to be used, and who would have access to it, and how would it be protected and controlled. And from that perspective, one of the key issues of data governance that I think is becoming clearer and clearer is that context matters and purpose matters. And again, here I'm echoing other speakers, that the kind of data really matters in terms of whether it should be public or not and how it should be governed. Fantastic, really interesting examples from places like Taiwan, where data about where masks are available has been made public so that people could more easily buy masks. Brilliant. But obviously, if that, you know, a system that told publicly the general public who had bought masks would be of great concern. You know, I don't want the fact that I might have bought 5 masks or, you know, no masks or 20 masks necessarily to be public. And so, you know, context matters, the purpose for which data is being gathered and going to be used matters, the nature of the data matters. And I would also just add that whilst on the one hand, we've seen greater awareness and some landmark legal challenges and legal discussion about really hard-edged accountability, there's also been some disappointing trends in terms of lack of transparency and data on government procurement of resources, as a very basic example in the UK. And I think that would suggest that there's still a long way to go in terms of how data can in fact be used for greater accountability of institutions, and therefore in turn trustworthiness of institutions.
Great, thanks, Sui Leng. And I'm not going to ask you the A-level question that everyone probably in the UK has to answer these days. But I do want to. I saw Nuria, meaning you've done also a lot of head shaking and either violently agreeing or disagreeing. I wasn't sure what the nonverbal was. But
mainly agreeing.
Let me go back to you, Nuria, and say, so how does this resonate with you being a commissioner in charge of data science? But also, more importantly, I do want to come back to the involvement of citizens. I mean, I think it's great to have a citizen science initiative, and it's very it's wonderful the way you have structured it. But also, how can you also engage citizens beyond sharing data, right? So can they also be part of what was mentioned, like John mentioned, is that it matters what the question is. Can they also be part of even determining the question, right? And so how do you engage with citizens around the use of data? And this is a question I would like everyone to reflect on if you want. But why don't we start with you, Nuria?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. I think as Sui Leng has mentioned, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we are being flooded with data every day. How many cases, how many deaths, how many. So data has become this really important concept in people's lives, you know, something that maybe had never realized that it existed before, right? So I think it's really raised a huge amount of awareness in all citizens about, you know, the fact that data matters, the fact that having high quality data is important, the fact that decisions will be better decisions if they are based on evidence, you know, and also in terms of what kind of data is being captured by the technology that I use, something that of course, you know, we know for decades, you know, for a long time, but, you know, I think it's become very prominent now on everyone's minds. So in terms of the setup, I think there is a lot of, there's a very good environment now in terms of engaging with citizens on data related topics. And a very important one is education. The average knowledge on data matters, at least in Spain, you know, is not that high. So I think education is a very important action to develop, you know, and to engage with. And education also applies to the public administration. For me, one of the biggest take-home messages and one of the biggest priorities is the digitization of the public administrations and the change of mindset in the public administrations. I still 6 months later, they still think that data is sharing a PDF with me with a table. Even though I've been telling them repeatedly, you know, since Mark, this is not data, this is just a PDF with a table. I would like to know how you created this table. Whatever place you took the the numbers that appear on that table, that is where the data is. So there is a huge need, and I would say urgency, an urgent need to really invest in creating a much more data-centric mindset in public administrations, at least in Spain. I think to me that will be one of the biggest priorities. And it has been one of the barriers that have made it difficult to really leverage data. Even we're talking about data sharing in the concept of like privately held data being shared, for the public interest. But there is also a lot of data sharing that needs to happen between ministries. That doesn't necessarily happen, and the systems might be different. There might be political reasons why they don't talk to each other, if it is a coalition, for example, or they might not like, there's this sense of sometimes of this, like the Lord of the Rings, the data is this like, it's my ring and I don't want to share it even though I'm not doing anything with it, but whatever, maybe it's really important because other people want it. So I think data sharing within institutions is also a barrier. It's also not really necessarily happening. It's been mentioned in the context of research institutions, which is the case, particularly in the biological sciences, but also within public administrations at all levels. So within the same level across departments, and then of course at different levels, the local with the regional with the central. Countries that are federated, like Spain or Germany in Europe, we've also suffered the difficulties of data sharing at different levels, where the autonomous regions are not sharing the data, with the central government, or the central government reports some figures that don't match the figures of the regions, right? So I would say the citizen aspect is very interesting, it's very important, and I think there's a good timing right now, but I really want to emphasize the challenges and the urgency on the public sector side of things. I've worked in the private sector all my life, and this has been an awakening to me,
Great, and thanks for that. And yeah, the whole issue of information sharing in government is something I worked on for many years, and I always made the reflection is that I've never met a person in the public sector that got promoted because they shared data, because the whole incentive structure is around hoarding and control as a result of data ownership. And then I think absent that kind of change in the way you get evaluated whether you do your job well by sharing, it's going to be an uphill battle. But John, I want to go to you because, again, as Nuria already said, this is not unique to the public sector. Surprise, surprise, academia and research organizations suffer from the same kind of disease, and sometimes for good reasons, right? I'm not, it's not as easy quite often. But what's your reaction towards how do we actually accelerate data sharing, even if it's limited, but at least where there is some sharing?
So I think this idea of education really gets at it. And again, like the reason we share data is so that data gets used. And so, I think one of the mistakes of the last, decade of a lot of open data has been celebrating the posting of data.
Yeah.
And as opposed to celebrating the number of users of data. And the universe of data users is not as big as we want it to be. It's quite small. And in particular, I think we've just moved the blockade from data being available or accessible to there are people who can use the data. And when we unpack that, part of it is education, as Nuria said. I just completely support that. But I also think that we should be talking very honestly about subsidizing compute. Because the big interesting data that we've got, at least in my field, often it's too big to download easily. And stewards of the data like Sage, if we suddenly had 1,000 people downloading 25 terabyte data sets, we would be bankrupt because of the transfer costs, right, under the cloud systems. So we need to start cultivating and subsidizing cloud usage of data, because it's what enables a lot of these frameworks to work, which is that you can monitor usage inside the framework in a way that licenses cannot, in a way that contracts cannot. And so if you made it easy and cheap to compute in the cloud, people would compute in the cloud and they would do exploratory analysis. Whereas in the life sciences, at least, everyone's funded by a grant. They do the analysis related to their grant and no more, and they will not burn a lot of time and money on exploratory things. So we have to make it really cheap to mess around with data, as well as really safe to mess around with data. And that starts with, I think, public utilities that provide cloud computing. Or if you can't get to that, because we can't even pass a budget in this country effectively, maybe it could be vouchers to buy cloud time at private vendors, where the government negotiated terms that were privacy protecting in bulk form, as opposed to this individualist thing is like John takes his lab credit card and opens an Amazon cloud account. Because that's what, it's just not happening. And when it does, it's not privacy protected. And so I think that's really the second piece behind education is the people who are already able to use this data have a very significant resource constraint, which is compute power to crunch data in an exploratory manner. And we can release that very quickly through subsidy.
Very interesting. Sui Leng, so you wanted to engage on my earlier question on citizen engagement. So all yours.
Thanks so much. Yeah, sort of reflections on all of the comments. The provocation and, in a sense, call to arms of public administration being more datafied, whilst certainly demonstrated in real time by the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic, also I think comes with it. It comes with needs for, again, accountability and transparency. And actually, the A-levels saga that Stefan mentioned is a really good illustration of that recently in UK public administration, where because children weren't able to sit certain exams at final at the end of their education to sort of qualify for university and so on, the approach taken by the government was to grade students based on where they were ranked in their classes, but then also the historical performance of the relevant centre that they were attached to. So essentially the historical performance of their school as being the predictor of what their rank meant as their final grade. And so there was, in fairness, a great deal of consultation and, in a sense, public participation in the development of this. It is not the case that this was developed without any kind of public consultation. And I think the example actually really helpfully demonstrates the need for meaningful public consultation and meaningful public engagement, because what happened was that despite the public engagement, when it was actually used and implemented in the wild, as it were, there was a serious public outcry because of the unfairness that if you were at an underperforming school, you tended to get downgraded, and if you were at a high-performing school, you tended to do much better under the system, and that the grades weren't felt to truly relate to the efforts of the individual students, but rather to their sort of demographics and the profile that had been applied to them by the system. And I think one of the ways that could have been avoided is if, in developing the system, there had been better information provided to the public, so that when people were commenting on it, they had a better understanding of how the system was proposed to work. It's probable that the government conducted a data protection impact assessment as required by the GDPR, but it's never been published. Those sort of basic aspects of transparency and thus accountability, I think, really will help to ensure that when public administration is becoming these digital, data-driven sort of systems and processes, we still have the kind of public buy-in and democratic discussion that we would hope.
Yeah, no, I think this is extremely important, and also relates to the mission on education. Meaning, as you know, we just held a data assembly here in New York, which is a citizens' assembly around the use of data, and so one of the questions we had was that, anyway, what's your sense of the use of aggregated and anonymized telecom data? and then we had a discussion. And then we asked, do you know what anonymized and aggregated data is? And the majority didn't know. And so it's like, anyway, so it's a very hard discussion, right? If you even use terms that are not well understood, also don't know what the trade-offs are of and the risks and so on. And I think the reason why we did this, by the way, with the public libraries was because we do believe that public libraries have an important role to play with their patrons to also have that conversation in a more meaningful, but also educational kind of context. I'm sensitive to the time here, so let's move to the magic wand part of our conversation, which is the last part. So Patrick, if I would give you a magic wand you can use this to make one change or address one element, what would be your priority?
Oh boy, I mean, that's a hard question. There's a long way to go, right? With the data ecosystem right now. You know, we've been talking about some of the challenges around data sharing and licensing. We've been talking about the challenges around data education and data literacy, and just, you know, the risks associated, because it's kind of, you know, we're still in the Wild West in a lot of ways. But if I had to pick one thing, I think interoperability would be a huge one, because I think this tends to address a lot of those concerns in subtle ways. You know, obviously you would have to go much deeper on each of those topics, but I think this gets us to a place where we can start having those conversations, right? Because it's both technical and institutional. You know, often, you know, governments are really hamstrung with problems around budgets and regulations and staffing or myriad other things, right? And so they just sort of output the data to meet the letter of the law or the letter of the project without really meeting the spirit of it. So, you know, thankfully, a lot of the public-private collaborations that I'm seeing are starting to enable the government to catch up as it relates to the application of technology and the application of data. You know, you look at things like Amazon's GovCloud, the education enablement work that the Data Coalition is doing to increase, you know, awareness around data-related questions, or, you know, even some of the open data work that we've been trying to do with people like U.S. Census, the EPA, you know, CDCs, both U.S. and EU. You know, and there's plenty of examples out there about how enablement is happening. It's just a question of, you know, slowly driving awareness and adoption of available resources so the government can really start taking advantage of, you know, next gen tech. And I think that's really only going to happen when we start taking a critical eye at interoperability, both, you know, of our technical systems. You know, how are we making the things that we build and the things that we use and the insights that are derived from them, how are we making them accessible? Not just to ourselves and our immediate, you know, echo chamber, but other people that may have context that we don't. And I think that's extremely important. And, you know, the same thing with the data. You know, how do we not only provide people with raw data, which is kind of what's happening right now, right? You know, a lot of places, like you look at people like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. One of the things that they did very early on was required anyone that they gave a grant to had to share their data for at least 7 years afterwards. That's fantastic. The problem is most people didn't have either the technology, you know, the technical capability or the infrastructure to do so well. So it ended up on a dusty FTP server somewhere that no one knew how to find. Or once they found it, they had no idea what column ZX42Z, you know, actually meant. You know, it didn't come with a lot of the explanatory context. It didn't come with a data dictionary. It didn't come with all of the kind of supporting things that you need to really be, you know, interoperable and reusable. So I think, you know, that's probably the thing. If I had to wave a magic wand, really thinking about interoperability and, you know, as a result, reusability. You know, I think a lot of data right now is a result of some very intelligent and capable people going off into a dark corner somewhere and performing these complex incantations on the data and then coming back and delivering their insights. And every time we have to ask a question that is tangentially related to the work that they've done, you have to go reinvent the wheel every time. You know, you can't go kind of build on the shoulders of those giants and continue to ask more and more sophisticated questions, because you're always having to sort of solve the underlying, you know, initial question yourself. So I think that's probably where I would go first.
Great, cool. John, you already mentioned subsidizing computing power. Do you have another priority very briefly? And then I will go to Nuria and end with Sui-Leng.
I would say massively expand human rights protections in the United States, civil rights protections like the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act.
Right.
So that some of the harms that are currently legal, like genetic discrimination in wide swaths of American economy and society, would become illegal, and that would make it much easier to balance risks and benefits by sharing data.
Great, awesome. Nuria?
Well, I think I already mentioned a little bit my priority. I think it would be profound transformation of the public administration. So they become much more data-driven, they become much more data savvy, and they really move into a model of basing their decisions on evidence and scientific evidence, knowledge, and data, which is not the case right now.
Cool.
And together with that, I would add a big change also on data sharing and transparency from the size of the governments to the citizens. We do have transparency laws, but they are not necessarily always sharing, all the data that should be shared or all. And I think you cannot have trust if you don't have transparency. It's one of the necessary elements for trust, honesty, and transparency. So I think I would also include a lot of transparency in terms of the data.
Great. Sui-Leng, you have the last word. No pressure.
A greater focus and awareness on purpose and on context, and I mean in particular the social purpose and the social context that has produced data in which data are proposed to be used, and through that the potential harms that might result from misuse or inadvertent, incorrect, unhelpful use, to try to mitigate, avoid harms to people and their lives. Great,
thank you so much. Sui-Leng, John, Patrick, Nuria, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom. I've learned a lot, and it all will add to our third wave of open data. And stay well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Ciao.